Thank you. Good morning. Are you glad to be here? Well, today we are continuing our series of messages on the life of David. This is the fifth message, and we'll have two more after this week. We're going to look today in 2 Samuel chapter 9. And I will share with you this morning that this story is the climax of David's life. And I have to warn you that after this, the story takes a dark turn the next 2 weeks. So we're going to celebrate where he is today. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to look and see how it is that David, who starts out so strong, ends up so weak. The next 2 weeks are more of a cautionary tale about what happens when we are seduced by power. What makes the story the next 2 weeks so powerful is that it's true also of us. That we can find ourselves at any point in David's story. Today is a story of compassion and kindness. It says that one day, David asked, "Is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. "Are you Ziba?" the king asked. "Yes, sir, I am," Ziba replied. The king then asked him, "Is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them." Ziba replied, "Yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He is crippled in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. "In Lodabar," Ziba told him, "at the home of Machir, son of Ammiel." So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. His name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, "Greetings, Mephibosheth." Mephibosheth replied, "I am your servant." "Don't be afraid," David said. "I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father Jonathan. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table." Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, "Who is your servant that you should show kindness to a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said, "I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and servants are to farm the land for him to produce food for your master's household. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will eat here at my table." Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And Ziba replied, "Yes, my lord, my king, I am your servant, and I will do all that you have commanded." And from that time on, Mephibosheth ate regularly at David's table like one of the king's own sons. Bow with me for a moment. Gracious and heavenly God, today as we hear this story of compassion, may we look inside ourselves for those places in us where we need your love and kindness. And may we look outside of ourselves to others who also need your love and compassion. I know that every person who is here today is here for a reason. And I pray that you would use this word today to speak to us whatever it is that we need to hear. Amen. Danny Trejo is a well-known actor, although you may not know who he is by his name. You would know him if you saw him because he has a very distinctive look. He has a rough exterior. Danny Trejo usually plays characters in movies that are criminals. He plays criminals, sometimes drug lords, drug cartel leaders, things like that. If you happen to see Breaking Bad, he was a regular actor in that movie. He has 380 movie credits to his name. Now, the reason he plays these parts generally is because he does have kind of a rough-looking exterior. Also because his early life reflected the parts he plays. In the early part of Danny's life, he was in prison. He spent a lot of time in the criminal justice system, and he lived a life of crime. The reason I share this story with you is because he has recently written a biography, an autobiography about himself. It's called My Story, My Life of Crime, My Redemption, and Hollywood. And this last week, he was being interviewed, and he's being interviewed in a lot of places right now about this book. And he said something on NPR this week, which he said in several places. He said this. He said that everything good, every single thing good that's happened to me in my life has happened to me when I've shown kindness to someone else. He's stating a basic fact. If you want to have a good, meaningful life and you want things to go well for you, show kindness to others, show compassion to others. And he says everything good that's happened to him has happened as a result of him being kind to someone else. You know, I heard that. I thought, wouldn't it be great if everybody felt that way? Wouldn't it be great if our world turned that way? Because sometimes it feels like that our world has less and less compassion all the time. I look around me and I look at our politics, I look at our religion, I look at our social media, I look at our neighborhood, I look at our families, and sometimes I look at our religion, and sometimes it looks like those important places in our lives are missing something that makes life good, and it's compassion and kindness. Consider the story of David Sharp. In 2006, David Sharp was on his way down from the top of Mount Everest. He climbed to the 29,000-foot peak of the mountain. And 984 feet from the top, he ran out of oxygen. And there he died. And he froze to death. What makes this story so tragic and heartbreaking is that 40 climbers passed him on the way to the top. All 40 had the opportunity to offer aid and assistance to David Sharp, but instead they chose to continue on upwards. Well, you have to make a decision if you're climbing Mount Everest, because you spent somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 climbing to the top. So they had to make a decision. Do we save ourselves? Do we climb to the top? Or do we help this man here? Well, to this day, David Sharp's body is still on the mountain, frozen in the spot where he died. In fact, there are more than 200 climbers that are still stuck on top of the mountain who are left where they have died. Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first to climb Mount Everest, said this about the situation. He said, the whole situation on Mount Everest is horrifying. All people care about is getting to the top. And we all know those stories, don't we? All know those stories, how people have sacrificed kindness and compassion, have walked by the needs of others, all in their desires for self-fulfillment. That's why Eugene Peterson, who wrote this great book on David called Leap Over Walls, said this. He said, the supreme irony of the world we're living in is that a world that has spoken so much about self-fulfillment, when society has written so much and focused so much on self-fulfillment, shows so little evidence of it. Now let me ask you a question. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Mephibosheth. Only a few. Raise your hand if you can say Mephibosheth. I had to pray before I got up here because it's in the text like 4 times and I have to say it all morning long. The story of David and Mephibosheth is one of the climax moments in David's life. So how did we get here? So here's what happened. going back last week. King Saul, the king of Israel, is on Mount Gilboa, and he's wounded by the Philistines. And rather than being captured, he pulls out his own sword and falls on it and ends his life. His son, Jonathan, is also killed in the battle, and his kingdom comes to an end. At that point, David begins to consolidate his power. He spends the next 7.5 years defeating his rivals, and establishing himself as king of all of Israel. David moves the capital of their faith all the way to Jerusalem. He recovers the Ark of the Covenant and moves it to the city of David, from which God can speak to God's people. And God makes a covenant with David in that moment and says, David, your name will be great. You'll always be remembered. David, I'm going to give you rest from your enemies. David, your homeland, my homeland, will be my people's homeland, and they will have rest from their enemies. And when you, David, are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up a descendant who will build a home for me, a temple, and who will be on the throne forever, someone from your family. So now David has been king for several years. David's now in his 30s. He was in the wilderness in his 20s. Now he's in his 30s. And he asked this question. At the top of the mountain, he has gone from being a sheep herder to being a criminal to being a warrior to now being king at the top of the ladder. And he asked this question. Is there anyone from Saul's family to whom I can show kindness? Now he's remembering something here. He's remembering because he'd made a promise to Jonathan, who was his best friend. Jonathan knew that one day, because of who David was and because God's hand was on David, that one day David would be king. And so he said to David, David, when you become king, will you remember to show loving kindness to my family? Because in that day, it was ruthless. When one king took over the throne and they dispelled another dynasty, they would execute and kill all the family members of the former dynasty. So it was expected that David, when he became king, would kill everyone in Saul's family and Jonathan. So he made a promise. And then he made that promise to Saul too also. I will love your family. And this reveals something about the character of David. Because David didn't have to keep the promise. Everybody was dead. No one would have cared. No one expected it. And we all know it's easy to make a promise and much harder to keep a promise when the circumstances have changed. You know, you're sitting on the beach. You've got a nice drink in your hand. It's a moonlit sky. And you look at the person in front of you and you say, I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you till death do us part. It's so easy to make that promise, but so hard to keep it when you've got 3 kids and you've got a lot of bills and they're running around everywhere and you're sitting on used furniture. It's a lot easier to keep that promise when you say, I promise I'm going to pay that payment on the 15th of every month for that shiny new car of mine. It's a lot harder to keep the promise when you're 100,000 miles in with a few dents and dings and it doesn't have the new car smell. But David kept the promise. And so he asked the question, is there someone that I can show kindness to? And Ziba, the servant, says, well, yes, there's Mephibosheth, but he's broken. See, what happened was, when Saul died that day on that mountain many years before, Jonathan's son was Mephibosheth, and Jonathan died. The nanny that was taking care of Mephibosheth grabbed him up, and in a panic, believing they would all be killed, ran out of the palace and tripped and fell on the steps and landed on top of Mephibosheth and crushed his legs. And they never set properly. And so for the rest of his life, he was physically unable to walk in a way that others could. He had to live with it for the rest of his life. Now, when Ziba says, yeah, there's Mephibosheth, imagine, yeah, there's Mephibosheth, but he's broken. He was essentially saying to David, don't worry about him. He has no value. He's of no value. He's a broken man. He's of no use to you. He's no threat to you. And what I love about David here is David in the story doesn't say, well, is he a threat? What does he look like? How did he get that way? He doesn't question anything. He just wants to help. I love that about David. This is the first thing we should learn about grace from David's story today, and compassion. That compassion does not look at a person's merit before offering care. Love looks for the opportunity to be shared. Now it says in our scripture, it says that Mephibosheth was living in a place called Lo Debar. Now that's Hebrew. Lo means no. Debar means pasture. And what that means is that Mephibosheth, the broken one, was living in a desert wasteland. He had been forced from the palace, he had been broken, and he was now living his entire life in a wasteland. And there's something about his spirit that is reflected in his name. It's believed that the name Mephibosheth in Hebrew means seething disappointment. The idea here is that he's not only perhaps broken in body, but he also may be broken in spirit. So if you will, imagine the scene. Would you just imagine the scene? There's a knock on the door. It's a soldier. And the soldier says, the king wants to see you. Imagine the fear in his mind. What could the king want? He's going to execute me. They take Mephibosheth to see David. Imagine Mephibosheth then bowing, not in respect, but out of fear. And the difficulty he had of lowering himself to the ground and calling himself a dead dog. And then immediately, because of David's heart, David shows us what a heart for God looks like. A heart for God is a heart filled with compassion that uses power and influence to better another person's life rather than to better themselves. So David immediately reverses the situation and says, don't be afraid. I intend to show kindness to you. I'm going to restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather. I'm going to give you servants. And you will always be welcomed as one of my sons at my table. The word used for loving kindness is used in this text 3 times. The English word is weak. It's a word that's used all throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. It is the word hesed, spelled C-H-E-S-E-D, and this is what it means. Steadfast love, loyal love, covenantal love, unconditional, generous, extravagant, uncalculating. You know that love if you've ever held your own child at birth in your arms. You know that love if you stood at an altar and looked at another person's eyes and said, I will love you forever. That's what it is. You know that love if you've ever been baptized. Because when you're baptized, these are the words that were spoken over you. You are my beloved. I hesed you. This is what David was giving to Mephibosheth. Now, 3 things we learned very quickly. That compassion is more than words. It involves action. When David made the promise, that was not compassion. Compassion was when he actually did something. You know, when you see those TV commercials every Christmas about the poor dogs that are living in terrible conditions, in bad weather, chained up and not enough food, and you know that feeling that you feel when you see it and you want to turn the channel? That's not compassion. That's sympathy. Compassion is when your wife goes down to the shelter and keeps bringing home these pets to foster them. That's compassion. We're about to have number 8. Compassion is more than just reacting to the needs we see. It's searching out needs to meet. David didn't say, well, if somebody shows up, I'll help him. No, David went searching. We had a woman in a former congregation who went through divorce, a very bad time in her life. It was all she could do to take care of her kids and herself. And one day she came home from work and somebody had mowed her yard without asking and continued to mow her yard every day, once a week, without ever telling her who it was. He just saw a need and met it. And the other thing is that compassion is more than giving money. Now, don't get me wrong. It's important to give money. But compassion also involves building relationships. In this story, he invited Mephibosheth to his table, established him as a member of his family. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible because every time I read it and as I think about it and I imagine it, it almost always brings me to tears because I think of the scene. I think of Mephibosheth down on his knees in front of David. And I think all the resentment that he's carrying for David in that moment, because every time he tries to walk, he connects his brokenness to David. And I think about the fear that he feels. And I think about how he's on the ground. And then I see David in this scene walking across and saying, do not be afraid, and bending down and looking into his eyes and picking him up and standing him up tall and saying, don't be afraid. You will be a member of my family. And I see him walking with him and sitting him down at a table filled with food, and to his left and his right are his new brothers and sisters. Because every time I think of that story, it brings me to tears because I remember another story of a son who took his father's inheritance and ran away from home and spent it all in wasteful living, and then who returned broken and humbled and fell at the feet of his father. And that father bent down and picked him up and put a robe on his shoulders and a ring on his finger and said, prepare the fatted calf because my son who was lost is home. And every time I think of that story, I remember all the times in my life when I've walked into a sanctuary and I have felt seething disappointment, despair, broken in spirit, humbled by my own sinfulness, maybe even fearful. And I think of David, and I think of that loving Father, and then I think of Jesus Christ, who always meets me in the same way, who grabs me by my hand and lifts me up and looks in my eyes and says, you are forgiven, and you are welcome at my table. You don't have to spend any more time in Lodabar. You don't have to spend any more time in a wasteland. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to continue to live in your seething discontent because you are forgiven in the name of Jesus Christ. He looks in your eyes and calls you by your name, your baptismal name, beloved, and you're forever welcomed at his table.